All right. I think we will get started.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming here. My name is Shekhar Surukai. I'm from McAfee. I'm a fellow at the Cloud Business Unit. And I'm very delighted to share the stage with Nemi here. So let me have you introduce.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nemi George. I'm the Vice President and Information Security Officer at Pacific Dental Services, based out of Irvine in California.
Great. So we have a couple of interesting topics to discuss today. The first one is the next slide, please. Yeah. We're going to talk about Pacific Dental's move to AWS and the kind of security issues they had to address as they went production, which Nemi will talk about. And then we'll talk about how MVISION Cloud sort of helped in that journey and where they're going next as well.
All right, so about 2 years ago, we decided to take the journey to the cloud, like most people, I guess. But just before I talk about that, a brief sort of introduction into PDS, and that would give you some idea of the type of business that we have. We provide platform services, so infrastructure as a service, software, hardware, everything that you can think of that fits into a dental office outside of the dentist. The dentist doesn't work for us technically. Everything else from building, brick mortar, systems, that's all us. We open about 100 offices a year. In comparison to us, our competition, if you call them that, in some cases open 3-4 offices a year. So our scale of growth was just crazy, and we were noticing very quickly that the infrastructure we had was just not set up to scale. We were in a data center that was going down on average once every 2 months, which if you're in the data center business, you know that's not acceptable at all. I went there, actually, I tried to keep the name out of this presentation, but I did go to see them one time, and they had 3 generators on the back of 2 flatbed trucks. And I sort of went, no wonder we have all these problems. So anyway, we effectively provided managed service, and we had to give our owner dentists, I would say, their money's worth in terms of the services that we provide. So what I would not stand up here to say is that we had this amazing cloud strategy or roadmap. We did not. We literally saw the cloud as save our souls. We've got to get out of this data center. So we lifted and shifted, moved as much as we could into the cloud, got set up, and we have, over the last 2 years, started going back to look at all the things that we've migrated and working with companies like McAfee, saying, how do we make sure we have the best setup? How do we configure ourselves for success? And some of those lessons are some of the things that I hopefully would be able to share with you today. We all know why most people go to a cloud: cost, efficiency, all those things. We went through all of that. Innovation, agility, certainly advantages that we have seen with our journey to the cloud. So the traditional environments, your traditional data center, infrastructure-centric environments no longer exist. I was coming in today and I was joking, speaking to a few people about the fact that I was at reInvent 2 years ago, and it was largely at the Venetian, and now we're spread across all of these hotels and having to be, taking shuttle buses around. And it really occurred to me that in, 10 years, Amazon has just come in the cloud space and completely dominated. And 2 things are common. You have user centricity and you have data centricity, right? And if you're able to keep those 2 things in view, then you have some hope in securing your business. And so the picture that we kind of paint here is that's what a lot of security people, the picture behind, that's what we're used to managing, keep the data inside. And in my role as a CISO for this sort of organization, that model is completely broken. my data is everywhere, and I have to work with companies and tools that allow me to keep track of where my data is and all the various things, whether it's an IaaS service or a SaaS service. Anything you want to add?
No, that's good.
Okay. So one of the things we did over the last, actually about just over a year ago, was we went on a journey with McAfee, some of which we'll talk about today. So some of the tools you see on here from Box, Office 365, Okta, there's so many others that are not on here. We use those tools today. So what are the things that we've done? How have we got here? The first thing is inventory our assets. This, I would say, was probably the most difficult thing that we had to do. We even had to call folks who no longer worked at PDS, people who had left, just to get an idea of what data was where, especially on the marketing side of the house. A lot of stuff in marketing is outsourced to third parties. A lot of them are much smaller organizations than most of us are used to dealing with. So just trying to understand where our data sat was the biggest challenge that we had initially. Classifying the data and understanding if we were happy from a security standpoint to have patient data on-prem versus in the cloud. Initially, we were going to move just tools, so Jira, Confluence, CI/CD processes, very basic tool sets were the things we're looking to migrate. As we went through the cloud journey, we felt more confident to move a lot more things to the cloud. One of the other things we did was change management. We started out, and if there's one thing that you take away from this presentation today, is really about security professionals engaging early on with the dev teams as they take this journey to the cloud. That's certainly something that we didn't do. We sort of sat in our ivory towers, as it were, and they were doing stuff. We knew they were moving things. We knew they were talking about AWS, and we kind of sat there and said, well, when you're ready, we have this very defined, gated process, and when you're ready, come through those processes from change, release, and we'll kind of talk you through. We'll look at the work you've done. If we're happy with what you've done, you get a stamp of approval, and then you move on to the next phase. We very quickly found out that you couldn't do it that way. So some of the things we want to talk about today, building out a cloud-first platform. I mentioned not to talk about how big we are, but to really emphasize the challenge that we had. There was really nothing out there for an organization like us in terms of a traditional dental EMR, so an electronic medical record system. We used the legacy system that was really end of life and has been for a long time. There's really nothing globally that supports 850 dental offices, which is about what we support today. So we had to build something that scaled very quickly. We partnered with Epic. Epic, most of you would know, control about, I believe it's 60 to 70% of the US healthcare data through their systems. They have a very small footprint in dental called Wisdom, but it was certainly built for a standalone mom and pop shop. So we set out to work with them to build a dedicated, unique tenant for PDS that was going to scale with us. The other thing we had to do was go away from just traditional lift and shift and start taking on new services that were cloud first. Spinning up services that were purpose-built for the cloud, moving away from traditional security tools, and getting tools like MVISION that we're going to talk about that were cloud native, if you like. And one of the things that we're doing, and we're not there yet, but one of the things that we're doing is we're looking at moving a lot of our databases, so full data warehouses into the cloud, and kind of getting away from traditional Microsoft application and database stacks. So we'll talk a little bit about that.
Great. So sounds like you've come a long way in your cloud journey and securing it. Is there anything else you need to do at all, or what's your sense?
I think the biggest thing for my team or for PDS, is just bringing together security and the DevOps teams together, working a little bit more. In a few slides, we talk about the waterfall versus agile versus DevOps or DevSecOps, and I have my thoughts on that. But building in security into the application process, I think that was the biggest thing. And this is where I have managed global data centers, security applications, the whole 9 yards. The one thing that I hadn't actually done prior to this role was manage an applications team. And so I've been in my role for 3.5 years. And the first couple of months just speaking to application, actually, how many people here write code? If you're in app dev in here, anyone? Just one? All right, so I might get away with my application jokes. But I just couldn't understand a word of what this guy says. Stories. It's like, for God's sake, I've come to work, I haven't come to tell stories. And the sprints and the releases and CI/CD, and it was just like, for God's sake, we've got those gates, get your process, be ready, come here, give us the code, we'll look through it, we'll get a consultant to come in, we'll review your code, we'll tell you if it's good, we'll tell you it's broken, and go back and start again. And so we very quickly found out that we were completely slipping when it came to business timelines. The business expected deliverables. We were effectively, my team was holding up the business because we had not evolved the way we did security to match what was actually happening within the organization. So that integration was very, very key. And I'll give you some practical things. We went from having our change advisory board, our CAB meeting once a week, to doing 3 different CABs in a week. We had Monday, Wednesday, and we had Friday. One of them was very specific to Epic, because a lot of the Epic code was done outside of our control, but we needed a check before we released it into production. But the reason we did that was to make sure that we were a little bit more dynamic and moving with the pace, or at the pace the business was moving. And skipping on to, so my joke about application was waterfall versus agile versus DevOps or DevSecOps. A lot of people subscribe to one versus the other. Certainly a lot of things that I've described with a gated process certainly sit in the waterfall methodology. You go through the different steps, and then there are different requirements, and you get all the way through, and then you get to the end, and you deploy, and hopefully everything works. And if it doesn't work, then you do have to redress and start again. What we had to do was just break it down, like, fail small, fail fast, essentially was the way we kind of looked at it internally, and making sure we had this continuous cycle of feedback. And as we go further on, I talk about the topic, which we didn't really spend time introducing, was about shifting left, and which is true. People like us need to shift left. But also should the applications team, they've got to engage early on. So they've got to shift right, as I put it, engage earlier with us. And I like this picture, and it cracks me up, and it's kind of playing with the words, and I said, does it, which kind of refers to IT, does it matter? And I was looking at waterfall, and I took these 3 pictures on here, because if you do a quick search for the various waterfall methodologies, you see there's so many that come up. There's actually about 8 or so very well researched and used, referenced methodologies on just waterfall alone. And the point of putting this up is the methodology you adopt really doesn't matter, because we can't even agree on what waterfall is, never mind all the other things that come up. So if we get hung up on the terminology, then we're kind of missing the point. The point is that in our organizations, we don't build the bottom. So you don't have the customer, the business user, so far away from security. And I use security because that's my passion. But really, I'm talking about IT governance as a holistic function. And so we can be so far away and we can have the silos, because what tends to happen is you work through the process and then you end up getting sent back to do things again. So that was the biggest lesson that we learned. Now, I'll talk about some of that later on, but there are really, really simple, practical things that we did. One of which was just releasing some of those tools that we as security professionals guard with our lives. You know, our vulnerability scanning tool. We have our annual or monthly or quarterly scheduled vulnerability scans, and no one even knows the name of those tools. We just send out an email to the organization and we tell them we're running a scan, or we don't even tell them we're running a scan. We just run it in stealth mode, and then we give them this really large CSV export and tell them all the things that are broken that they need to fix. Or if you have a level of maturity, you integrate it with Jira or something like that, and then you push out work orders effectively to people and tell them all the things that they have to fix. And one of the very first things we did was train up our dev teams to use some of the tools, and you can speak to me afterwards. I'll tell you some of them. This is even prior to us going on our MVISION journey, and so we train them up on those tools so they could do basic configuration checks. And we're talking about the simple things that all of us know about. Scanning to OWASP top 10, just self-scan, self-assess, self-service, self-report, and hopefully self-remediate before it gets to the security group. So that's really what this slide is about. Encourage your teams to share information. The security groups should engage early on, and the business users need to have that free flow of information so that everyone is on the same page. We know what we're building, and we're not seen as getting in the way of the business doing what it needs to do.
Great. Nimi, it's very interesting because we've worked with a number of customers, and we see the same challenge, which is that all of our customers have a number of applications they're moving into AWS, and the security team does not want to be the bottleneck. In fact, we did some in our recent CAR report. Our findings were that, like in financial services, there are 171 cloud services, applications, home-built applications which are moving to the cloud, and it's increasing on a daily basis. And the ability for security teams to step away, but still have a secure application which rolls out into AWS is the core of what you're saying. And how many apps do you have in?
Custom applications, we have 247. Not all of these may class as an application for most people. And I'll explain why briefly. So we have an intranet. Everything that happens within our business really revolves around our intranet internally. The doctors, medical is a very, very data-centric, data-driven business. So daily production, how they're doing, patients for life, return patients, all that information that is taken from all the dental offices feeds directly into the intranet. So we have the PDS Connect internet, and underneath that, we have various widgets and applications that run various aspects of the overall site. So, but if you take the individual packaged applications, custom apps, not including SaaS applications or any of that, we have 247,
right,
which is a lot.
And you don't want to be in the in the path of every one of those apps, and you just can't scale your team to achieve that. And so I think that's really the core of the shift left strategy. And at McAfee MVISION, we've been working with design partners such as NEMI and others to sort of look at security holistically, right? A lot of the traditional security revolves around post-deployment. So once applications are already deployed, you do a scan of configurations of your data at rest and all of that, which is still very important. So you ensure that there's no deviation from what you expected. But what we're talking about shift left is the pre-deployment aspects as well. So your application can actually be born secure in some sense. And so the kind of things which you typically do in post-deployment is manage drift, which is you think you've set up your configurations for your infrastructure as code, which are deployed into your production through CI/CD processes. How do you know that some admin has not gone and changed permissions on your S3 bucket, for example, to make it more pervasively available? And those are the kind of drifts you want to capture. You want to be able to look at data and understand what kind of data resides in what of your data stores. And also pay attention to the fact that advanced threats in the cloud are cloud native in the sense that they can potentially exploit APIs, your trust domains and things like that in order to attack your data in the cloud. And so being able to look at those are important for post-deployment situations so that as your applications are running, you're keeping track of all of these. But I think you can do better in the pre-deployment phase as well, which is that all these three which I talked about are important, data at rest and what's being stored and who's accessing it and so on and so forth. But as we talked about earlier, there's literally hundreds of your application development teams or your business units which are constantly deploying applications, versions of their applications, many times every day. And and when that frequency of changes happen, unlike a traditional data center, your infrastructure is also code, and so that also gets updated, and you have no controls around, has my infrastructure configuration changed, this last build which got spun up. So being able to ensure, for example, like a security group isn't excessively permissive at build time or at development time even is interesting, and it's possible in the public cloud world. It's also very important to check for vulnerabilities in code, because as you go into containers and code which is dynamically built, a lot of times you pull in open source or other libraries which may have vulnerabilities, and the speed with which applications are deployed today, traditional ways of doing weekly or quarterly scans are just not going to cut it, because the rate of change is pretty significant. And so those are the kinds of things you can do by looking at moving security controls further left as well. And the reason why both post-deployment and pre-deployment are important is that cloud-native threats are very dynamic, and they can happen at the speed of cloud. I mean, literally, if you have an S3 bucket which is open, somebody's already scanning it and downloading the data from that S3 bucket. So these are, and these kinds of data breaches can happen not necessarily with malware, but in many cases because of a shared responsibility model where the customer is expected to have certain configurations set appropriately, which may not be the case. And so what moving left in your security controls allows you to do is not be reactive. That is, once the application is running in your AWS environment, check for some issues and then go and fix it, because it may be too late. It's like playing whack-a-mole with your configurations and so on. So what we're really doing, and essentially what Nemi talked about earlier, is push your security audits at release time or even at build time, so that as your code is deployed, all the libraries which it pulls in, as well as the infrastructure as code which it depends on to be running in production, can be more secure. And so, working with customers like Nemi, what we've done in MVISION Cloud is really enable that. So when we, like many security products, we started off by doing scans of your config audit and your data at rest post-deployment. And over the last year and a half, we enabled controls to be done at release time or build time. And the way we do it is we've exposed all of our security controls, our APIs, and we integrate with your various CI/CD tooling. So if you're using native AWS code pipelines, you integrate with that. If you're using open source tooling or other third-party tools, for example, Bitbucket to do manage your code and Jenkins to build and deploy, we integrate with that as well. So what happens if you are an app team, you're developing code, and you've created a template for saying my code is going to be running on these 3 EC2 instances, this S3 bucket, whatever. So you do that, you edit those pieces of those files, and check it in. As soon as you check it in this demo situation, we've integrated with Jenkins, which kicks off a build. So it takes all of that code which the application team has deployed, built, and tries to build it. And in this case, let's say the developer has actually misconfigured an S3 bucket configuration. And as I said before, infrastructure is code in AWS, right? So there's no hardware which are racking and stacking. And it's just a JSON file where you have some S3 configuration. Let's say the developer made a mistake, our DevOps team, somebody made a mistake. They can edit a configuration, commit the changes, and as soon as they commit a change, which is, let's say, bad, Jenkins picks up the build, executes it, and at that time we scan your configuration files to see if there's any issues we find by looking at best practices like CIS benchmarks, or you can configure your own to say what are your expectations of your development application teams. But since this IaaS infrastructure was badly configured, we actually can fail a build. And the feedback to the application team comes back in the native console which they're using. It could be, in this case, Jenkins. It could be in, like I said, in AWS native tools, whatever. And the reasoning would be that the DevOps teams don't want to go into a security tool to figure out there's an issue. They have less friction in terms of understanding what the issues are, so they can fix it so that the application can continue to the build process. And the details are immediately available. In this case, they may have a couple of warnings, and there's a failure because there is a very permissive egress rule, or there's an S3 bucket which is publicly accessible, things like that. And the same mechanism we use to check for infrastructure as code, we also check to see if there are any vulnerable packages which are being pulled in by your applications. So integrated into the CI/CD process, as the build triggers, we check for any files which are infrastructure as code templates, as well as any libraries which are getting pulled in based on artifacts and things like that. And we fail a build, again, if there are some high priority vulnerabilities which are being pulled in as part of the packages which you're trying to deploy. And so these are two examples of how we are taking security controls which you would traditionally find after the fact. Like if you misconfigured your S3 bucket or an EC2 instance, you can find it later or you can find it at build time. Same thing with vulnerable packages. And we do it in a manner where we can do continuous monitoring and control at runtime, but also do it at development time. And so, Nemi, I know that you guys are also looking at containers and stuff. Do you see all of this? How do you see all of this security controls play with containers?
I think, so just to kind of take what you've said and turn it around from security standpoint, a lot of the demo you just saw was using the native tools that the dev teams use and feeding them the information in the language, in the setup, in the GUI that they are used to. From a security standpoint, we get to effectively see the same thing, this time fed to us in the language we understand, in the tools that we are used to, right? So from a container standpoint, you want to make sure that, one, you scan the containers, you do real-time configuration audits. You can do this based on a number of things. You can have templates that are preset, pre-reviewed, pre-approved by your security team. And so anything that deviates from, anything that drifts or deviates from that, you get a notification. The one thing that I would say when it comes to container security, again, just going through the lessons that we've learned, is start small, right? So using MVISION, there's probably, and you would know better, thousands, or at least close to thousands of rules and policy alerts that you can get. And it's just overwhelming. The first couple months after we went live with MVISION, actually the system stopped working. Well, stopped working. But we found that the reason it stopped was because we'd set it to max out at, I think it was 4,000 events, where an analyst had to go in and actually acknowledge those events. And because they were not doing that, the system was pretty much saying, well, I'm not going to feed you all this new data because you're not doing anything with it. And so we picked about 20 different things that we felt, speaking to the developers within our group, that we wanted to see. Simple classification, high, medium, low. The things that were high for us were mainly around access. I started talking about access and how the identity of who's having access to your data, as well as the data itself, is the most important thing that we have to worry about today. So if you have unrestricted access, unrestricted outbound flows, things like that, we would get policy notifications, we get alerts. We have medium alerts, which are usually around things like unencrypted S3 buckets or unused security groups. If you've taken the time to define security groups and you've had them for months, years, maybe, and there's no activity, nothing, there's no templates are being built, no users are being added based on those groups, and maybe you have a group that is redundant, something that you need to get rid of. So we have those as well. And then we have low, informational alerts that come up. So we want to make sure that we're doing those scans. CIS benchmarks are pretty good. They have your traditional benchmarks for on-prem traditional applications. They also have adopted those or adapted that for cloud applications now. So you can use that. You can use OAuth, as I mentioned earlier. Giving those tools to developers, doing the scans, doing the vulnerability assessments early on. One thing I want to touch on is nano segmentation. That's something that comes up a lot. And the example that I use, I spent 9 years working in telecom, so most of my stories end up going back to telco. And you think about the Nokia 3310, which is, other than the BlackBerry, I'm a die-hard BlackBerry fan, but outside of the BlackBerry, I think the Nokia 3310 was maybe the best mobile phone that was ever built. And when you think that that thing, as we would refer to it today, had more processing power than some of the machines that first launched satellites into space, that's really the way I explain to my team what microsegmentation is. So you're going from having to put your hands around a big sort of beast of a machine, where if you get it right one time, then you're good. You're taking all that power and you're breaking it up into tiny, tiny chunks, and you're having to do the whole security process all over again. That's why the traditional approach simply doesn't work. So you've got to build a system that is repeatable, automated as much as you can, that gives you the same level of security without you having to replicate it every single time someone goes to spin up another instance within your cloud environment. So if you're able to do that, and that's what we refer to as a runtime security, so you free up your dev teams to go spin up another instance, they do that, it ticks all the boxes in the background, and it tells you within, in our case, MVISION Cloud, there's so many other tools out there that will tell you if there's a concern or something that you have to deal with. And if it's not, then you just let it go. And maybe it's a concern, but this is where you have to take your cloud strategy and match it with your internal risk tolerance level. There's certain things that may be showstoppers within your organization. And in that case, you do have to call a halt to the project and have things remediated. In other cases, maybe you can allow things to proceed and then readdress it at a later stage. But you do have to secure the smallest computing units of your operation, because it's effectively Lego bricks. You're building tiny bits. Every one of those pieces is an independent, autonomous machine that, if compromised or in the wrong hands, is able to do damage to your organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Lego example, is very applicable to the container world. And I think one of the differences as you see this evolution into a micro services kind of model is that, and combined with containers, which is ephemeral in nature, is that lateral movement of threats are very challenging to detect with traditional ways of looking at IP addresses and putting these very hard firewall rules and things like that before you deploy applications. And there's a need for application identity, where you can say this web tier of this application cannot talk to the database or an S3 bucket or whatever, or these two microservices can't talk to each other. And that level of policy, understanding what is normal communication and then what is abnormal is something which we we have as part of our product. You can see a demo of it in our booth downstairs if you're, or in where's,
a few miles away.
In a few miles away, actually. Yeah, but certainly something which I would highly recommend. But the idea there is that as you're moving to containerized deployments into AWS and public cloud, you do need to address all three issues, the two top issues we talked about, which is, how do I know that what I'm deploying in my containerized, applications don't have vulnerabilities in code, and how do I know that the infrastructure as code templates which I'm actually using to manifest my application, don't have misconfigurations. And those are two very critical issues which you can address pre-deployment. And we actually have support for CIS benchmarks and other customized benchmarks, which you can check policies on Amazon ECS, EKS, as well as Fargate. And for runtime, which is the Nano Segmentation, which we talked about with Nemi, we actually have, really we think about it as zero trust software-defined Nano Segmentation, in the sense that we first learn what are the communications between different applications, different microservices, different tiers in your application, not based on IP, but by tagging what application components or reusable Lego blocks are communicating with each other. And then once you've learned it, we can actually visualize what are the processes or communications between those. And you can have control policies to say, if you do find a traffic from, let's say, that blue node to that green node, which never happened before, block it. And so those kinds of controls, visibility and controls of communications in a containerized application workload is something which we support as well for runtime security. And all of that capabilities we talked about, which is providing you visibility into IaaS configuration, into AWS configuration, into container configuration, into what kind of data is stored in your S3 buckets or other data stores in your public cloud, into threats which are cloud native, so that you can understand what kind of APIs are being invoked, what kind of privileges have you given to your administrators, things like that. It's something which we provide as part of the MVISION Cloud product, and it supports data protection, threat protection, continuous compliance. And with that, let me hand it over to Nemi to talk a little bit more about some practical nuggets to take away.
Yeah, so just a few things that I think we've learned and we're still learning. I'm by no means an expert. My team and I are still going through trying to reshape, refine, and relearn in some cases some of the things that we know from, I have a bunch of network admins and sysadmins and storage guys who have come from the traditional IT space. We've talked about shift left a few times today. I'm sure you're going to hear that throughout this conference. I want to talk about shift right, which is for those of us, and there's not many of us here, in application development, and that is just about getting better at clearly communicating the business requirements, what you're trying to solve in simple business language that the security team and all the other stakeholders can get together, understand, rally around with, and make sure that we're all very clear. Business enablement is also critical. I've spent a lot of my time, and it feels like I spend more of my time trying to interpret technical things in simple language that means I don't have to talk security gibberish and people actually get it. And one of those is when we came up with the need to move certain applications. I actually remember doing a slide to the execs, and I went in, and the first thing I had on my slide deck was, how many of you hate VPN? And everyone looked at me like, are you serious? Is this a real question? Like, we hate the VPN. I was like, yeah, I know, I hate it. I actually don't use VPN. I don't know when last I used it. And so that was my lead-in into my presentation of saying, hey, look, we have Okta, we have some of these other applications, we have additional tools like adaptive MFA and all that. Maybe if we move some of these applications that we have 3-4 layers deep behind the firewall and make them, in some cases, just lifting and shifting them, in other cases, completely rewriting the code, the user experience is going to be much better. And at no point was I selling them, oh, we need to make this more secure. It was more about improving the user experience, enabling the business, and people really latch on to that better than just more security, because the obvious question, if you haven't been asked it, at some point you will be asked it, is how much is too much security? And no one knows the answer to that. My personal pet peeve is number 4, which is, I should coin that phrase and maybe get a copyright in it, which is don't play psychic fodder, which just means fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And there was an element of this with my team, which was telling the applications team initially, well, you're throwing all this data into AWS, you're going to get breached. You know, when you get breached, you're going to come back to us, and then we're going to sit down and have a conversation about how to do it right. And that's really the wrong approach, because, you know, no one can really, if you've done a lot of risk management, you can predict the impacts, you can predict all that stuff. It's very difficult to predict the likelihood of an occurrence. And so just making sure you are working with the business rather than sitting down and saying, well, things are going to break because you haven't necessarily done it my way. Code scanning is another thing that I think was mentioned a few times today. And take that loosely, because what I mean by that is more talking about self-service. Whether it's actually scanning the application code or building templates that have gone through the relevant security steps, vetting, so that you have a baseline control set that you're confident that applies to at least 80% of the applications that your teams are going to build, and then releasing them so they can use those templates to build further without having to continually come back to the security team for review and approval. Then one other thing is we looked at the MVISION cloud and the feature sets. One other advice would be to keep things in learn-only mode initially, because a lot of times the tendency is you have a new shiny object, you want to enable all the policies, light it all up, especially when you're looking at micro-segmentation. It's a new world for most people. Understanding the data flows, the communication patterns between all of your applications is going to take time. And so if you just have written a policy on paper, you have a really nice cloud strategy, and you take that and translate it into actual policy and rule sets without letting the tool run and self-discover for a period of time, so you kind of know what known good is, you are just going to have a lot of people knocking at your door. So that's another thing to say. And the final, I think, slide for me was just to say, as security professionals, we simply have to reinvent ourselves. You know, I was at Vodafone for 9 years. And in 9 years, I managed a global enterprise operations team, which under me, we had 9 data centers, 4 of which were Vodafone data centers. The other 5 were partnerships with everything from Rackspace in Australia to SunGard in Atlanta to Cable & Wireless in the UK. We eventually acquired them and a bunch of other people. So really thinking about it, in 10 years, we've gone from Vodafone strategy. We created a whole new company called VCHS, a Vodafone Cloud and Hosting Services. And our plan is literally to take over the hosting business. But we did it by building blocks on traditional infrastructure services that we were used to having, 68,000 people over a week in Vegas coming to a conference by a bunch of booksellers. When you really think about that journey over a period of time, one thing that comes to my mind is the ability for us, and I say this from a structured sort of governance security standpoint, of not being too precious about the things that we hold dear and being able to reinvent ourselves and move with the changing times. And on the screen, we talk about cloud. We've said enough about that. We're at AWS. Right? We talked about consumer being king, right? The customer wants the data when they want it, in the format they want it, at the time they want it. And our job is to deliver it to them. There's some other things that traditional security would have said, no, you have to come in through this gate, through this machine, with this cert on your endpoint to be able to get access to your information. Identity, mobility. People want the data to follow them everywhere. For years, we have tried as a security community to hold on to the data ourselves so we have better control over the data. That's where businesses like Sky High and Netscope said, no, release the data. Well, we'll give you the ability to tell, judge, and control what's done with the information, depending on where the information goes. And I put a line on there, which most of you would have seen on LinkedIn. I took creative license and liberty to change that. And going over a 20-year timeline there, we've gone from, in 99, saying, don't get into cars with strangers. I'm sure most people would have had those conversations. And then don't meet people on the internet. Then Uber comes along, and now we go on the internet, and we meet people, and we get into the cars. And that's essentially the role that we play. And if there's one thing to take away from this is you can be the mom, the dad, the brother, uncle, whatever, standing on the corner saying, don't get into that car. Or you can be the person that says, well, you can get in the car, but I'm going to do this, and I'm going to tag you, and I'm going to do all this other stuff that gives me some level of assurance that I can track where you are, and I have some ability to control your security. And that's really what we have to do. And that's what myself and my team alike are doing. And it starts with something we haven't really talked about, which besides the tools and the technology and all that stuff, it really just goes to training. There's a lot of information that is available. Shout out to Amazon, I guess, or AWS. They've done a lot in making training available, and we have to avail ourselves of the training and the tools and technology that we have to make sure that as companies around the globe reinvent themselves as software companies, that as a security organization, we build in our processes and our tools to evolve with them and ensure we're making our businesses secure and not restricting their growth.
Great. No, Nimi, I think just to reinforce what you said, we in McAfee, we did a survey earlier this year of about 1,000 odd enterprises who are using public cloud. One of the questions was, do you think AWS is more secure than your private data center? And for the first time, we got a majority of respondents who said that actually it is the case. So that shift, in not getting into a third party's car to actually using it is happening right in front of us. And I think what we as McAfee do is enable that, accelerate the adoption of AWS and the public cloud essentially to enable more applications, to be deployed and get more business value for enterprises like yourself. So thank you for your insights, and we're open for any questions.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Yes, please.
I'm not sure if I need a microphone. Speak out loud.
Well, I am over here and I have it, so you might as well go for it.
So the question is to you, since you said the one thing you don't suggest is get into the development late, involve security from the beginning. As your experience, so if I want to get involved with not knowing as much about security in the cloud, what would you suggest? What would be your approach?
Good question. So here's the approach that I'll say. Number one, the move to the cloud has actually made, to some degree, our jobs as security professionals easier, because there are a lot of native tools within AWS. Remember, we talked about the CIS benchmarks, talked about OAuth, and I mentioned those two in particular because those are free, those are available. And Shekhar was talking about things like, if you're using Jenkins or Bamboo or whatever you're using to release code, and it's very easy to tie that with your AWS instance, right? You put your ARN, you map them together, and there's this plethora of different things that you can do, and you just start with what you feel are the most important to you. In my case, we started with just 20. And even with the 20 that we started on, we had so many alerts that we were pretty much maxing out the system. And there were simple things like if you have a certain S3 bucket that is shared publicly and is not encrypted. If you have, say, with the OPS top 20, that's very easy because you already have the values and the variables, they're all set. So if you have that connected to your whatever code repository, then it automatically does a scan for you, and then it gives you the findings. Now, this is where the paid for tools then add an additional value. Now, just using MVISION as a simple example, it tells you you can go into the console. It's really easy. You go into the governance, or you go into the threat and analytics console. You click into it. You have your policy. It tells you what policy has been flagged. You just click on that one link, and on the right, it comes up with a set of remediation steps. They usually, I think I haven't found anyone that's gone more than 6 or 7 bullet points deep. And it's very, very, very prescriptive. It tells you, go into network and security groups, go into network and settings, go into, say, open or unrestricted, whatever, set this to off, set this to on, or disable or enable this, hit save, and you're done. So I will start with those sort of tools to build that out. The other good thing, again, with AWS is we took advantage of the free AWS professional services offerings. So we've had a number of AWS immersion days. So they come on site, they sit with us, they go through all of our code, they help us build those basic templates. And I don't know if that's going to change long term, but right now we're able to ring them up. We get some really, really good services for pretty much nothing, and they help us build that. So we're kind of learning as we go along.
Any other questions? Oh, come on, there has to be one more. All right, one over there. On the
We're
other
standing this way because the lights at the back is so bright. So I'm not trying to avoid eye contact, I'm just trying not to stare into those lights.
Thanks. Let's shift right. So my understanding, you work with app development team. What is your relationships with ITSec? Do they come to you and kind of start yelling at you, hey, what are you doing in the cloud? Or do you come with them and say, I need to do A, B, and C, and they come back saying, here's your checklist, that's how you need to comply with our requirements?
So I'm actually ITSec.
Oh, you're ITSec.
Yes.
So let's reverse this. Did you at some point find out that your developers have a cloud deployment, and so how did this play out, the whole thing?
So when I started, just to recap, we had a really crappy data center. We had to move to the cloud. There was no cloud strategy. There was nothing. It was, we need to get out of the data center. So that's what we did. We moved all the stuff we needed. We shut down the data center. That was our operational priority to do that. I also am responsible for IT operations. So for the first 6 months, let's just say I took my security hat and tossed it to one side and did the operational lift and shift. Once we had finished that, we then went back. We had nothing. We had no configuration. We just had raw CloudTrail logs. There was no tools, nothing reading it, no dashboards, and absolutely nothing, no templates. And that's when, effectively, there's no grand answer. We just had to roll up our sleeves and go back to work. So we had a bunch of days with AWS. Well, we actually started out doing a consultant engagement with a company that does that sort of work. And so they came in and they did a 2-day security assessment. I got a lovely 58-page PDF report that told me everything that was broken, from still having default root accounts, not having MFA enabled in our root account. It was all sorts of really, really basic things that we should have done the first time around. So what we did, we took the 58 pages, because no one likes to read PDFs, and then we converted into a Smart Sheets tracker. And that was the first thing we did. So we started with that, got people in the room and said, all right, guys, we're stable. We've done our migration. I forgot to add, we also moved to another data center. So we still have an on-prem, but much reduced footprint. So once lights were on, things were not breaking, we then went back and had to prioritize internally to fix all of those things. And then the question was, do we wait and do another 7,500K assessment once a year, get another 200 findings that we have to firefight to fix? And then we started looking at tools like MVISION and others that give us exactly the same thing, but it does it every single day. It just happens. Someone just needs to go in, review the dashboards. And the dashboards are really good because you can filter based on your line of work. So the security team looks for threats and anomalies. Other teams look for performance. And then we kind of take action. And we're not where we need to be. We have more alerts than we have people. But that's a problem most organizations, I guess, have to deal with. So that's what we did.
Let me dig a little deeper here. So do I understand correctly that your developers at some point came to you and said, here's what we need to do. We need to have infrastructure in AWS.
Yes.
And you started looking into this and you started deploying it step by step and securing it as you go. Because I see companies who have developers use their development budget to actually create new accounts in AWS, start the whole thing, build a conveyor, start building in there, and then ITSec would just realize, hey, something's wrong with the traffic outside of the company. We see our whole development team going there and doing stuff. So this was not your case, right? You actually worked with them to build it.
We worked with them. So it's a little bit of both, and I'll try and be clear. So it was a little bit of both. We had to move data centers. We had to move, and then in moving the data center, we went from a really poor data center. We were in Switch in Vegas, which is much more expensive. So we made a decision to reduce our data center footprint to just our core legacy practice management systems, move everything else to the cloud. That was the decision that we made as an organization. Once that happened, the dev teams then went all in. That's where the security team kind of went a little backwards, and we let the dev teams do the migration. It was a project to move data centers, move into the cloud, rather than let's secure this. That was about 6 months in. Once that was done, that's when we came in and said, let's do an audit of our cloud environment, and that's where we saw all the issues that we remediated and all that. But your second point about developers just going off and doing stuff, in enabling and empowering our dev teams to move to the cloud, a lot of that started happening. But it wasn't so much data, it was more for tools and services. So they'll just buy something, and we suddenly have all these logs and we have all these things that we're playing with, which wasn't necessarily setting up instances for my company. It was buying a lot of tools that they could just buy in the P cards and stick it in and put data to it. So that's where we had to come up with a governance structure to say traditional security controls like change management and all that still apply. The fact that we're in the cloud doesn't make it any different. Now they know that we have visibility to see a lot of stuff, and so that brings it back full circle. So people are now coming back to us, and we're working together.
And in MVISION, we have this notion of shadow IaaS usage.
Yep.
So if you have new accounts which weren't sanctioned, which are being suddenly using AWS, you get notified, and the security team can take action on it. Great. I think we're done over time, but thank you all.
We've got 30 seconds.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.